2.11, our last one of chapter 2. Uh, we've seen some of these words show up already, but we just want to talk about them a little bit more. And that is the basic words of and more or less than. Percentage statements tend to have these words involved, and it's important to understand how closely related things can be and how different they are too. All right, so if you just look at these four statements that are given here, current budget proposal, funding that is 13% less than. All right. Uh, Number of violent crimes in Chicago is 283% of what they were 1 year ago. Dosage of a generic drug is 20% more than, or current funding levels are now 87% of what they were in the 70s. And all of those are stating a comparison between two numbers, but they're just stating the comparison in slightly different ways. All right. Now, if we flip over the page, the first thing we're going to do is just talk about what the word of means. I have it written down here. If you just Google definition of, you get a pretty short thing. If you go find some websites, you can find very long, complicated definitions for the word because we use it in a lot of different ways in English. All right, this is definitely what we're trying to get at with us. The word of is expressing a relationship between a part and a whole. And that sounds like a percentage for sure. All right. So, this next little question here, we've got a few blanks to fill in, and you should just think about these or try them a sec and see what kind of makes sense. So, we have the number 40, the number 6 is being compared to it, and we get 0.15 in the end, 15%. All right, so we're discussing the relationship between 6 and 40, but you'll see there are some 46s involved in here too. All right, so just pause a second, see what you think for those few blanks. All right, here's what they look like. This is how we use of. All right, 15% of 40, I can't not say it, is 6. That's how big 6 is. That's what part of 40 6 measures out to be, 15%. So we say of. Now, when we get to more and less than kind of statements, though, that's where we're looking at the difference between two numbers, and that difference is 6, as we can see here. And so the number 6 isn't appearing in the sentence, but we're describing how big that number is relative to 40 again, but in a slightly different way. So 46 is 15% more than 40. And here's this just a slightly different way of expressing the exact same thing. That 46, how big is it compared to 40? Well, obviously it's bigger. And rather than describing how big the difference is, we're just straight up describing how big 46 is. It's 115% of 40, just straight up. The mores and the less thans are always describing some sort of difference or change and how big that is. All right, so there's a bunch of statements right here in number 3. These are the kind of phrases that you would see. We're going to just talk about budgets and spending as a context in this exploration. So, for something we budgeted $40 and we spent $46. So, which of these 5 statements are actually correct then? So, maybe read through them a second, just think about it, and then we'll talk about them. All right, so 46 is more than 40, like we just talked about up here. In particular, it's 15% more than 40. So it would be accurate, certainly, to say this guy We spent 15% more than we budgeted. Our 46 was 15% more than 40. Um, but this statement was also a correct statement, and that would be we spent the 46, what we spent was 115% of the 40 that we budgeted. All right, the rest of them are not quite right. They describe less than, or they're comparing, a couple of these are comparing the planned amount to the spent amount, which is the reverse of what the 15% means for us. All right, so here is just different numbers, same idea though. So suppose we planned on 150 bucks, that was budgeted, and we spent 168. All right, compute the percentage and make those two sorts of statements, but for these numbers instead. So pause and do that a sec. All right, here's what things look like if you, well, how big a difference was this? So if you subtract the two, we spent $18 more than we budgeted. That is 18 out of 150 is 12%. So the sort of statements we would get look like these. We spent 12% more than our budget is one way of describing how big 168 is relative to 150. Or we spent 112% of our budget, and that straight up measures how, or that's just the straight up relationship between 168 and 150, rather than describing how big the difference was between the two. Okay. So, we've dealt with some lots of percentage formulas when we're comparing two numbers. And those guys both appear right here. Oops, well, there's one answer for you. There you go. So which one is getting used in these different cases? Well, what we keep talking about is that the more versus less than statements are comparing the difference between the two. So your compared number and your reference number, do the subtraction and then divide by the reference number. And then you can say what percent more or less than the reference number the compared number is. Of just straight up compares to how big the two are. Just like that. All right. I have to remind myself what's coming up. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Okay. So back here, for this question, and actually for the 46 versus 40 questions as well, we end up with two different percentages that are being stated. How are they related to each other? And I mean, it seems pretty clear pretty quickly that here we've got 12%, we have 112%. And up here we were talking about 15% and 115%. So hopefully that relationship is kind of clear, that the percentage you use for the more or less than statement, if you add 100% to it, that's the percentage that's used when we make an of statement. All right, that's important. Keep that in mind. This is number 7 here is similar to what we did before. But notice we're talking about the number 34 here instead. So try to fill in these blanks with the right words, and then we'll talk about them. So here we go. 34 is 15% less than 40. All right, the 15% is not telling you how big 34 is relative to 40. It's telling you how big the gap is. The gap is 6%, and that's how much less than 40 34 is. If you straight up compare 34 to 40, if you just did 34 divided by 40, you would get 85%, like so. And that is where the word of comes in. All right, so then the question is, well, how does this work? Because I specifically said the more or the less percentage plus 100 gives you the of percentage. And so here we have 15 and 85, and maybe you see pretty quickly that those add up to 100%, but that's not exactly what this is saying. So the way we think of these things instead, and this is what we saw too when we did these sorts of formulas, if you put a 34 in for compared and 40 in for reference, if you do subtraction, this top thing comes out negative, and so your computation comes out negative, and we can think of in these less than situations, the percentage change is negative. We just don't state the negative when we state the sentences. We use words like less than. All right. And in that case, so like here, if we think of the less than percentage as minus 15%, when we add the 100%, just like that, we get 85%, and that all ends up making sense then. All right. The back side, I would say, try 9A on your own first and see how it goes, and then we'll go over it. If you want to try the whole page on your own first, that's great. All right, but pause and give that a shot here. All right, so in this situation, what we actually spent versus what we planned to spend, we did the division and we got 1.092, 109.2%. So what are the correct statements? One with of, one with more or less than. Okay, well, the 109.2%, well, that's technically what we would see for the of statement. And when we talk about more or less than, the 9.2 is what gets at how big the difference is between the two. So again, 109.2 is just straight up comparing what we spent over what we planned. This measures the difference between the two and compares that to what was planned. But they say the same thing. All right. If you haven't yet, try this for 9B. All right, 0.73 was the result. So actual over planned is 73%. So the difference between the two is going to measure out to 27% then. All right, so we get these kind of statements. The of statement comes straight out of this calculation, like so. The less than statement in this case, because this came out less than 1, less than 100%, would be the 27. The percentage would take, if you did comp minus ref divided by ref, you would get negative 27%. But we don't state the negative, we just say things like less than. All right, the last question here can have multiple correct answers just depending on how you want to compare these two numbers. All right, 280,000 Lego pieces in a collection versus 1.1 million. Do a computation, make a statement. I have two of them written down that are related to each other. All right, but here, yeah, go ahead and pause, give it a shot. Here's what I've got.
Man, sure.
Okay, that was my high school son thinking he's hilarious and just sort of barging in. So here we are. I don't know how much of that got in the recording, but here we go. Finishing this off, here's the kind of stuff I said. I just straight up compared the smaller one to the bigger one. Got this number. So clearly this collection is smaller than that collection. So we could state that two different ways. So I'm comparing the small one to the big one. You could turn those around and get different sorts of percentages to compare the big one to the small one. Anyway, so Miguel's collection, 74.5% smaller, or his number of pieces is 74.5% less than David's. His collection straight up is 25.5% of the size of David's. And that should do.